Between 1980 and 1989, 6 members of 2 successive families living in apartment 85 at 7 Gvardeitsev-Kantemirovtsev Street in Kramatorsk died of radiation-related illness. A Soviet investigation eventually discovered the cause: a capsule of cesium-137 embedded in the building's concrete panels during construction, a misplaced industrial source entombed in the wall by accident, irradiating the residents of one specific apartment for years without their knowledge. The source was removed in 1989. The case was closed. It became one of the best documented radiation accidents in Soviet history, cited in nuclear safety literature as an example of industrial source control failures. The official explanation has one fatal flaw: cesium-137 at the measured activity level and the measured distance from the bedrooms cannot produce the radiation doses that killed 6 people over 9 years. The dosimetry does not work. Researchers who have examined this case have noted the discrepancy and attributed it to measurement uncertainties or to the position of the source within the wall. The measurement uncertainties are not large enough to close the gap. The position of the source within the wall was precisely determined by the 1989 investigation. The gap is real. Something else was contributing to the deaths, and the capsule was placed in the wall to explain what something else had done. I found this program through an electromagnetic biomedical research registry I was systematizing for an institutional inventory of Soviet neuromodulation research programs. Kramatorsk appeared as a cross-reference in a location I did not expect. In the KGB program registry for directed neuromodulating emitter development, there is an entry for a field test of prototype NME3 at a residential building in Kramatorsk. Period 1978 to 1986, results classified. Field test. Residential building. Period overlapping precisely with the deaths in apartment 85, without consent. In the Soviet era, there was no way to hide from surveillance. Every apartment could be monitored, every movement tracked, every secret exposed. Today, you have a choice. NordVPN encrypts your internet traffic and hides your identity from anyone trying to watch what you do online. Check the link in the pinned comment for an exclusive deal on protecting your privacy. Nothing personal. A classified KGB field test in a residential building, period overlapping with 6 unexplained deaths with classified results. Classified field tests in residential buildings with concurrent unexplained deaths are what archivists investigate. The NME3, neuromodulating emitter, third prototype, was a directed microwave device operating in a frequency range that the program's research documentation describes as
selectively affecting the neural oscillation patterns responsible for conscious spatial attention, producing sustained, involuntary orientation toward the emission source in subjects within effective range.
Not a weapon in any conventional sense. A device that caused people to stand and face a wall, to stand and face it, and to stand and face it for hours, without remembering afterward that they had done so. The NME research program had its origins in the Soviet Union's extensive post-war investigation of directed energy effects on biological systems. This was a research tradition that ran parallel to the better-known Western work in the same area. By most assessments, it was substantially more advanced in its practical applications by the mid-1970s. The specific research line that produced the NME series focused on frequencies in the range of 900 MHz to 2.4 GHz. This is the same range that subsequent commercial development would use for microwave ovens and, later, cellular communications. The research examined how these frequencies interacted with neural tissue. Early laboratory work had established that sustained exposure at specific frequencies and power densities produced predictable effects on the orientation-related neural circuits of test animals. The animals would orient toward the emission source and remain oriented. They maintained the orientation with apparent compulsion, rather than apparent preference, for durations that scaled with exposure intensity. Moving the source changed the orientation. Removing the source did not immediately change it. The orientation persisted for periods ranging from hours to, at high cumulative doses, apparently indefinitely. The animals did not choose to face the source. They were organized to face it, in the same way that a gyroscope is organized to maintain its axis. The NME series represented the attempt to miniaturize and refine this effect to a level suitable for covert deployment in built environments. The technical curator responsible for NME3's installation and field monitoring was senior engineer Alexei Ryabov, 49 years old. He was from a KGB technical division, whose official designation does not appear in any public organizational chart. He maintained a monitoring journal during the Kramatorsk field test period. It is the most disturbing document in the program file. Not because of what it describes happening to the residents, but because of how methodically it describes someone watching it happen. His journal from March 1981, 3 years into the test.
I want to document the cumulative effect pattern before the formal reporting period because the formal report will aggregate the data and I want the individual observations preserved. The pattern I have been watching for 3 years is consistent across all members of the primary exposure household. The episodes occur predominantly between 2300 and 0500, the period when the household is in the rooms closest to the north wall where the emitter is embedded. During episodes, subjects stand at distances between 1 and 3 meters from the north wall facing it, with eyes open. Duration ranges from 40 minutes to, in one documented case, 6 hours and 20 minutes. Subjects do not respond to external stimuli during episodes. They do not respond to their names, to touch, to sound. They stand. I want to document the specific observation that prompted me to write this entry, rather than filing it in the standard log. I was conducting monitoring at 4:15 on March 9th when I observed, through the remote observation equipment, the 7-year-old child of the household standing in the corridor facing the north wall, standing still. 4 in the morning, in the corridor, eyes open. I watched for 40 minutes before she returned to bed without, apparently, waking. The adults in the household have been losing 4 to 6 hours of functional time per night for 3 years. The child has been losing it for 2 years. I want to note for this record that I find the observation of the child more difficult to write than the observations of the adults, for reasons I will not elaborate on in a program document.
End of part 2. For reasons he would not elaborate on in a program document. A technical engineer watching a 7-year-old stand facing a wall at 4 in the morning for 40 minutes, and noting that he found this harder to write than the adult observations, and declining to explain why in language that makes the explanation visible to anyone reading carefully. The neurologist who investigated the resident's medical condition outside official channels was Dr. Irina Gorskaya, 52 years old, from the Donetsk Regional Clinical Hospital, who had been treating the families in her private capacity, and who had become convinced by 1984 that the clinical picture she was seeing did not match radiation exposure. Her notes, which she kept in a personal file that was not accessible through official medical records,
I want to document what the clinical picture actually looks like before writing the version I will file in the official record, because the official record needs to reflect radiation exposure, and what I am seeing does not reflect radiation exposure. It reflects something I do not have a clinical category for. The presenting symptoms in all 6 affected individuals follow the same pattern: fatigue out of proportion to any identified cause, progressive cognitive slowing, emotional blunting, and this is the symptom that does not appear in any radiation exposure profile I have read: a specific spatial disorientation. When asked to indicate north without reference to a compass or window, all 6 affected individuals point in the same direction. The same wrong direction, consistently across multiple examinations without communicating with each other about the test. The direction they indicate corresponds to the north wall of the apartment they share. They have been oriented toward that wall for years. They have been oriented so consistently and so deeply that it has become a proprioceptive baseline. The wall is north to them in the same way that down is down. This is not what radiation does to a nervous system. Radiation disrupts. This has organized. Something has organized their spatial orientation around a point in that wall, and the organization is deep enough that it persists when they are away from the apartment. When I ask them how long they have felt this way, they cannot say. They do not remember learning to feel it. It is simply how things are.
The direction they indicate corresponds to the north wall of the apartment. A neurologist documenting something radiation does not do: the organization of spatial cognition, the establishment of a false north that persisted even when subjects were away from the source, embedded so deeply that subjects could not identify when it had been installed in them. The director of the NME-3 program called Moscow in January 1983, after the first death in apartment 85.
I am calling to report a fatality at the Kramatorsk field test site. Male resident, 53 years old, primary exposure subject. Cause of death? Official cause: progressive anemia, cardiovascular failure, secondary to systemic exhaustion. The clinical reality is more specific. In the 14 months preceding death, the subject was experiencing approximately 5 hours per night of trance state episodes. Standing, facing north wall, unresponsive to external stimuli, no subsequent memory. His family attributed it to sleepwalking. He was not sleeping. He was standing with eyes open, in a functional trance state, for 5 hours out of every 24 for over a year. The device is functioning correctly? The device is functioning correctly. The effect is stronger than our models predicted. We underestimated cumulative exposure at extended duration. The original test parameters projected significant behavioral effects at 3 to 5 years. We are seeing more severe effects at 5 years than the model predicted for 10. Moscow. The death is attributable to the device? Director. Indirectly. The proximate cause is exhaustion. Years of neurological disruption. 5 hours of trance state nightly, progressive cognitive decline. The mechanism is the device. The body is not being irradiated in any conventional sense. The nervous system is being used continuously for a function it was not designed to sustain at that level of duration. Moscow. Additional deaths anticipated. Director. At current exposure duration and the trajectory of effects in remaining household members. Yes. The question is timing. And there is a second family in the apartment that will take the first family's place when they are eventually displaced by illness or death. Moscow. We need a cover explanation that will account for deaths in this apartment over an extended period. What do we have available? Director. There is an option that would require placing a radioactive source in the building structure, small enough to be plausibly accidental, large enough to be discoverable and to explain a pattern of illness. The source would need to be introduced into the structure at a point consistent with construction era placement. If the building's records are amended appropriately, a routine investigation would find the source and close the medical questions. Moscow, prepare the option. Do not implement it yet. Continue monitoring. When the program concludes, we will determine when and whether the cover is needed.
When the program concludes, determine when and whether the cover is needed. A program director and a Moscow official, in 1983, discussing the option to plant a radioactive source in a residential building's walls to explain deaths that were already occurring and deaths they anticipated occurring. The cesium-137 capsule found in 1989 was not an industrial accident. It was the option that had been prepared in 1983 and implemented when the program concluded in 1986. Here's the first contradiction. The official radiation safety investigation of the Kramatorsk incident is thorough, well documented, and internally consistent. It identifies the cesium-137 source, establishes its activity level, calculates the doses received by apartment residents over the exposure period, and attributes the 6 deaths to those doses. The investigation was conducted by qualified radiological specialists. The conclusion is that the cesium source explains the deaths. The dosimetric calculations in the same investigation show that the cesium source, at its measured activity and measured distance from the sleeping areas, delivers doses below the threshold for the acute hematological effects that killed the residents. The gap is not marginal. It is a factor that the investigators noted as requiring explanation and attributed to position uncertainty within the wall. The position uncertainty was resolved by the physical recovery of the source. The gap remained. The official investigation's own dosimetry does not support the official investigation's own conclusion. Both documents are in the same investigation file. One closes the case, the other reopens it. Here is the second contradiction. The official medical records of the deceased residents document radiation exposure symptoms: anemia, immune suppression, fatigue, progressive organ failure consistent with chronic low-dose radiation. These records are the basis for the official cause of death attributions. They are accurate descriptions of the terminal phase of the resident's illness. Gorskaya's parallel clinical notes document the earlier phase, the phase before the terminal decline, and describe something the official records do not contain: the spatial orientation abnormality, the false north, the trance state episodes that families attributed to sleepwalking. These symptoms do not appear in any radiation exposure profile. They are not produced by cesium-137 at any dose. They are produced, according to the NME3 program documentation, by a directed microwave emitter operating in a specific frequency range at a specific output level. The official medical records and Gorskaya's clinical notes describe the same patients. One describes the end of a process that radiation explains. The other describes the beginning of a process that radiation does not explain. Here is the third contradiction, the document that should not exist. The NME3 program's technical journal, covering the Kramatorsk field test from 1978 through the program's conclusion in 1986, contains a final entry that was written after the fact, after the program concluded, after the equipment was removed, after the decision was made about the cover. The entry reads,
Program concluded. Equipment removed from site. Site equipped with a radiation source for closure of medical questions.
Site equipped with a radiation source for closure of medical questions. The cesium capsule's presence in the wall is documented in the program journal as the program's final administrative action, not as an accident discovered years later, but as a deliberate placement recorded as such by the people who placed it. The program registry for neuromodulating emitter field tests lists 3 completed tests: Kharkov, 1971 to 1975, Donetsk, 1974 to 1979, Kramatorsk, 1978 to 1986. All 3 final entries are identical in their closing language.
Site equipped with a radiation source for closure of medical questions.
3 residential buildings. 3 planted sources. 3 investigations that found the sources and closed. The program registry does not explain why residential buildings were chosen as test environments rather than controlled laboratory settings. The choice is implicit in the data. Residential buildings provided long-term, continuous, involuntary exposure in naturalistic conditions. Laboratory tests produce data about laboratory conditions. The program needed data about what happened to people who were exposed for years in their normal lives, sleeping in affected rooms, eating in affected rooms, spending their evenings in affected rooms, without knowing they were subjects and without any option to modify their behavior in response to the exposure. The residential building was not incidentally the test site. The residential building, with the residents, was the measurement instrument. What was being measured was what years of covert exposure did to people who did not know it was happening. The deaths were data. The program file records them as adverse outcomes, not as catastrophic failures. They fell within a range that was considered acceptable for a field test of a prototype device. I found a 4th entry, NME4, field test planned, residential building, 1990s, status, completed, details, classified separately. I submitted an access request for the NME4 details. The request was denied. Insufficient clearance level for the classified annex. I searched the Ukrainian medical registry for patterns consistent with NME3 effects in residential buildings in the 1990s. I found a cluster in Mariupol. 6 cases of progressive unexplained neurological exhaustion in a single residential building, 1992 to 1998. No identified cause. Patients showed fatigue, cognitive slowing, and, noted as a clinical curiosity in one of the case files, a consistent tendency to orient toward the same interior wall of their apartments when asked to indicate north. The case cluster was reviewed by regional medical authorities. No common cause was established. The cases were closed. 6 cases, 1 building, an orientation toward an interior wall, a date range consistent with NME4's planned test period, and a classified annex I cannot access. I want to note one additional element of the program file before closing it. The NME3 technical journal contains Ryabov's aggregate data from the full 8-year monitoring period. The total number of trance state episodes observed across all household members, their average duration, and the cumulative exposure hours. The aggregate number for the primary household, the first family, is 14,600 hours. 14,600 hours of standing, facing a wall, unresponsive, over 8 years. Distributed across multiple household members, across 8 years of nights, accumulating gradually enough that the family never recognized it as a pattern. They thought one member was sleepwalking. They thought another was working late. They thought the third was simply someone who sometimes got up in the night. No one counted the hours. The program did. Ryabov counted them. 14,600 hours. That is the number in the file. That is what the program produced in one apartment building in one industrial city across 8 years before it moved on. I am going to close this file. I am going to note the electromagnetic biomedical registry cross-reference as reviewed. I am going to log my access. I thought the capsule was the event. I was wrong about what the capsule was. The cesium was real. The radiation was real. The deaths were real. The capsule was placed in the wall to make the deaths explainable by the cesium, because what actually produced the deaths was not something that Soviet radiation safety investigators were equipped to find, and because something needed to be found that would close the questions. 3 times this worked. 3 planted sources. 3 closed investigations. The 4th test is in a classified annex I cannot reach. The 7-year-old girl that Ryabov watched standing in the corridor at 4 in the morning is in her late 40s now, if she survived. Her family's medical histories are in the file. Some of them did not survive. He noted that he found the observation of the child more difficult to write than the observations of the adults, for reasons he would not elaborate on in a program document. I am closing the folder.